It is a heavy, wallowing Roman merchant ship, fighting its way through the treacherous currents of the Bosphorus Strait. Its hold contains no gold, no silks, no exotic luxuries. It is laden with a commodity far more precious, far more volatile: wheat. Wheat from the vast, distant plains of the Black Sea. The failure of this one ship, and the hundreds like it that make up the fleet, means more than a loss of profit. It means starvation in the city of Rome. It means riot in the streets. This is the story of the Roman Republic's forgotten lifeline, the Pontic Pipeline. It was a vast, privately run, and perilous artery of ancient trade that fed the Republic's rise to power. It was an economy that made some men rich, and it was a strategic vulnerability that created the very warlords who would, in the end, bring the Republic to its knees. To understand the final bloody death of the Roman Republic, one must first understand the hunger that fueled its rise. In the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, Rome was an exploding power, a city-state transforming into a global superpower. Its legions were constantly on the march, its population was swelling to unprecedented numbers, and its political ambitions were limitless. But this explosion of power was built upon a profound and dangerous agricultural crisis. Italy could no longer feed itself. The small family farms that had been the backbone of the Republic were being replaced by vast slave-run estates, the latifundia, which were dedicated to the profitable cultivation of wine and olives, not the subsistence farming of grain. This created a critical dependency, a strategic vulnerability at the very heart of the Roman state. The solution came not from the south, not yet, but from the distant and dangerous northeast. It came from the Pontus Euxinus, the hospitable sea, our Black Sea. This investigation will frame this vital grain trade not as a simple commercial route, but as the Pontic Pipeline, the great, unofficial, and privately operated infrastructure of commerce that was the true lifeline of the Roman Republic. It was a system as vital as the later, state-run Annona from Egypt, but it was far more chaotic, far more precarious, and far more open to disruption. Our journey will follow the path of this essential commodity, from the vast fertile fields of the barbarian Scythians to the wealthy Greek export ports of the Crimea. We will sail the perilous maritime arteries through the treacherous Bosphorus and across a sea infested with the pirates of Cilicia, a naval menace that threatened to starve Rome into submission. We will meet the great players who fought to control this pipeline, the brilliant Roman general, Pompey the Great, who was given unprecedented power to secure it, and his great nemesis, Mithridates of Pontus, the ambitious king who sought to seize the pipeline and hold Rome hostage. We will deconstruct the economy of this trade, a world of private entrepreneurs, immense profits, and catastrophic risks. And finally, we will argue that the century-long struggle to secure this vital food supply had a profound and fatal political consequence. It created the need for powerful, independent military commanders, the great warlords like Pompey and Caesar, whose ambition, forged in the wars for the pipeline, would grow too large for the old Republic to contain. This is the story of the forgotten supply chain that fed the Republic, enriched its enemies, and created the very men who would eventually destroy it. To understand Rome's desperate century-long struggle for grain, one must first understand the ideal it lost. The Roman Republic was, in its own mind, a nation of farmers. Its foundational myth was not of a great king or a wealthy merchant, but of Cincinnatus, the humble patrician who was called from his plough to save the state, and who, his duty done, immediately relinquished his power and returned to his small farm. This was the Roman ideal, a republic of citizen soldiers, men who owned and worked their own small plots of land, who were self-sufficient, hardy, and deeply connected to the soil of Italy. For centuries, this ideal was a reality, the bedrock of the republic's strength and stability. But a series of catastrophic wars and a profound internal economic transformation would shatter this ideal forever, creating a new and far more dangerous reality, a hungry superpower. The catalyst for this transformation was the Second Punic War. For 15 years, from 218 to 2000 BC, the brilliant Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca waged a campaign of almost unimaginable destruction across the Italian peninsula. His war against Rome was not just a series of brilliant battles, it was a deliberate and systematic campaign of economic warfare. He could not take the city of Rome itself, so he sought to destroy its ability to sustain itself. His armies lived off the land, and for over a decade, they marched up and down the length of Italy, burning farmsteads, slaughtering livestock, cutting down olive groves, and putting entire agricultural communities to the sword. The devastation was apocalyptic. The class of small, independent citizen farmers, the very backbone of the Roman army and society, was decimated. When the war finally ended and the surviving legionaries returned from their long campaigns in Spain and Africa, they came home to a ruined landscape. Their farms were destroyed, their families were gone, and they were often deeply in debt. They lacked the capital to rebuild, to buy new seed, to replace their lost livestock. At the same time, the Roman state, now in control of the great grain-producing island of Sicily, began to flood the Italian market with cheap provincial wheat as part of its war payments. For the small Italian farmer, trying to rebuild his life on a devastated plot of land, this was an economic death sentence. He simply could not compete. Into this vacuum of desperation stepped the new super-rich of Rome. The great aristocratic families, the patricians and the wealthy equestrian class, had grown fabulously wealthy from the spoils of war and the plunder of conquered territories. They saw the ruined farmland of Italy not as a tragedy, but as a massive investment opportunity. They began to buy up the small, failing farms for a pittance, consolidating them into vast, sprawling agricultural estates that came to be known as latifundia. These were not family farms, they were massive, industrial-scale agribusinesses, worked not by free citizens, but by a new and ever-growing workforce of slaves, the human spoils of Rome's relentless wars of expansion. Crucially, the owners of these new latifundia had little interest in growing grain for subsistence. Theirs was a purely capitalist calculation. In the increasingly interconnected economy of the Mediterranean, grain was a low-profit, high-volume commodity. The real money was in cash crops. The rolling hills of central Italy, which had once been a patchwork of small wheat fields, were systematically replanted with the two great cash crops of the ancient world, grapes and olives. Wine and olive oil were high-value, non-perishable goods that could be exported across the sea for immense profits. A single amphora of fine Falernian wine was worth many times its equivalent weight in simple grain. The agricultural landscape of Italy was being permanently and deliberately re-engineered, shifting from a model of food production for the masses to one of luxury production for the elite. This agricultural revolution had a devastating social consequence. The displaced rural population, the former citizen farmers who had been bought out or driven off their land, had only one place to go, the city of Rome. They flooded into the capital in their tens of thousands, a landless, jobless, and increasingly desperate internal migration. They became the proletarii, a massive urban underclass whose only asset was their children, proles. They were a volatile, hungry, and politically explosive new element in the heart of the Republic. At the same time, Rome's new imperial posture demanded a new kind of army. The old citizen levy, the farmer who would fight for a single campaign season, was no longer viable for a state that now had to garrison provinces from Spain to Greece. The army was professionalized, a standing force of long-term soldiers who were campaigning for years, sometimes decades, at a time. These men did not grow their own food. They were utterly dependent on the state for their daily ration of grain. This was the perfect storm that created Rome's great hunger. A massive, non-productive urban population and a massive, non-productive military combined with a domestic agricultural economy that was no longer interested in growing grain. By the middle of the 2nd century BC, the Roman Republic had a structural grain deficit. It was a crisis of both social stability and national security. The city had to be fed. The army had to be fed. The grain had to come from somewhere. The scramble to find and to secure a massive, reliable, and long-distance supply of this one vital commodity would come to dominate the foreign and domestic policy of the Republic for the next 100 years. The Pontic Pipeline was not a choice, it was a desperate necessity. Rome was hungry. Its gaze, once focused on the familiar fields of Italy and Sicily, was now forced to look further afield, for a new and much larger source of sustenance. That gaze fell upon the Pontus Euxinus, the hospitable sea, which we know as the Black Sea. To the Romans, this was a distant, semi-mythical and dangerous world, the land of the Golden Fleece and the Amazon warriors, a place on the very edge of the civilized world. But it was also a region of almost unbelievable agricultural fertility. The vast, flat, and well-watered plains that stretched northwards from the sea were a natural breadbasket, the Scythian plains of antiquity. For centuries, this region, and the sophisticated Greek colonial cities that dotted its coastline, had been the primary grain supplier to the Athenian Empire. Now, as Rome rose to become the new superpower, This ancient and immensely productive economy would be repurposed to feed a new and even more voracious master. The engine of this entire agricultural system was the land itself, the great Eurasian steppe, whose westernmost edge reaches the northern coast of the Black Sea, is covered in a deep, rich, and incredibly fertile black soil known as Chernozem. This soil, combined with a temperate climate and reliable rainfall, created one of the most perfect environments on Earth for growing wheat and barley on a massive scale. The peoples who inhabited this land, the Scythians, were a collection of semi-nomadic, Iranian-speaking tribes. While the coastal Scythians had settled down to become dedicated farmers, they were, in the eyes of the Greeks and Romans, barbarians. But they were barbarian farmers who were capable of producing a colossal structural surplus of grain, a surplus so large it could feed entire nations. But the Scythian farmers, for all their productivity, were not sailors. They lacked the ships, the ports, and the commercial infrastructure to sell their grain on the international market. This is where a second and more sophisticated group of people came into play, the Pontic Greeks. For centuries, the Greeks had been the great colonizers of the Mediterranean and Black Seas. They had established a string of vibrant, wealthy, and fiercely independent colonial city-states all along the northern coast of the Black Sea, particularly on the Crimean Peninsula. Cities like Olbia, at the mouth of the Bug River, and Pontic Pipeline, the capital of the Cimmerian Bosporus, were the great gateways of this trade. They were islands of Greek civilization and commercial expertise, planted on the edge of the vast barbarian world. These Greek cities developed a powerful and incredibly profitable symbiotic relationship with their Scythian neighbors. They were the essential middlemen, the master brokers of the Pontic grain trade. Their merchants would sail up the great rivers, the Dnieper, the Bug, the Don, and into the Scythian heartland. There, they would trade the manufactured goods of the civilized world: fine Greek wine, beautifully painted pottery, intricate metalwork, and jewelry for the raw bulk grain of the Scythian farmers. This was a classic core periphery economic model. The Greeks were trading high-value, low-weight, manufactured luxuries for a low-value, high-weight, bulk commodity, a transaction that was immensely profitable for the Greek merchants. The Greek cities became the great funnels and export hubs of this entire economy. They built the port facilities, the massive granaries, and the merchant fleets needed to store the grain and ship it to the south. The city of Pontic Pipeline, which controlled the Cimmerian Bosphorus, the narrow strait that is the only exit from the Sea of Azov, was in a particularly powerful position. It became the capital of the Bosporan Kingdom, a unique Hellenized state that grew fabulously wealthy by controlling the choke point through which a huge portion of the grain trade had to pass. The magnificent, gold-filled tombs of the Scythian and Bosporan kings, filled with exquisite Greek art, are the silent, glittering testament to the immense wealth that this ancient trade generated for both the producers and the brokers. This was the sophisticated, long-established, and immensely productive economic machine that the rising Roman Republic tapped into. As Rome's own grain deficit grew, Roman merchants, the negotiators, began to make their own way to the Black Sea in increasing numbers. They arrived with the one commodity that everyone desired: Roman silver. They began to buy up the grain surplus on a massive scale, driving up prices and pouring a new, even greater, river of wealth into the Pontic economy. But they were entering a world with its own established powers, its own rules, and its own dangers. They were the new customers in an old market, and their presence and their desperate dependency on this Pontic pipeline would soon draw the unwelcome attention of the military and political leaders of both the region and of Rome itself. The grain was harvested on the Scythian plains and consolidated in the great Greek ports of the Black Sea. But for this barbarian wheat to feed the Roman mob, it had to survive a long, perilous, and incredibly challenging journey of over 1,000 miles. The Pontic Pipeline was not a physical pipeline of steel, but a fragile, maritime artery, a network of sea lanes that snaked its way from the Crimea to the coast of Italy. The life of the Republic depended on the steady, uninterrupted flow of this artery. But this flow was constantly threatened, not just by the natural dangers of the sea, but by the greed of pirates and the ambition of kings. The story of this journey is the story of the immense logistical and security challenge at the heart of the Republican economy. The workhorse of this entire operation was the Roman merchant ship, the navis honoraria or ship of burden, often referred to as a round ship due to its wide, tubby, and deep-hulled appearance. This was a vessel built not for speed but for capacity. It was the heavy-lift cargo freighter of the ancient world. Unlike the long, slender, oar-powered warship, the round ship was a creature of the wind, propelled by a single, massive, square sail. This design maximized the internal space for cargo and minimized the size of the crew, making it the most economically efficient vessel for transporting bulk commodities like grain. A single, large grain ship could carry a cargo of over 300 tons, enough wheat to feed thousands of people for a year. The Pontic Pipeline was, in essence, a vast, privately owned fleet of these lumbering but essential vessels. The journey began in the great export ports of the Bosporan Kingdom. Here, the grain would be loaded into the holds of the ships, a laborious, months-long process that could only take place during the calm sailing season of the summer. The first great challenge was navigating the Black Sea itself, a sea known for its sudden violent storms and its treacherous rocky coastlines. But the true, terrifying choke point of the entire route came at its exit, the narrow, winding straits of the Bosphorus and the Hellespont. The Bosphorus, the channel that separates Europe from Asia and passes by the future site of Constantinople, was a navigator's nightmare. It is a narrow, 17-mile-long strait with a powerful surface current that flows southwards from the Black Sea. But beneath this, a strange, reverse undercurrent flows north, and the winds are notoriously unpredictable, swirling and shifting in the narrow, high-sided channel. For a clumsy, square-sailed Roman merchant ship, which was notoriously difficult to sail against the wind, navigating this strait was a high-stakes gamble. A sudden, unfavorable wind could leave a ship stranded for weeks, or worse, drive it onto the rocks. The Hellespont, the modern Dardanelles, presented a similar, if less severe, challenge. These two narrow straits were the inescapable geographical gateways of the entire Pontic trade. Any power that could exert military control over them could, in effect, place a stranglehold on the entire pipeline and hold the city of Rome hostage. Once a ship had successfully navigated the straits and entered the Aegean Sea, the dangers were far from over. The Aegean was a maze of islands, a place of sudden squalls, and, most critically, it was the hunting ground of the most significant threat to the entire grain trade, the pirates. The piracy that plagued the late Republic was not a small-scale, opportunistic affair. It was a massive, organized, and almost industrial-scale enterprise, an entire shadow economy that fed upon the legitimate commerce of the Mediterranean. For these pirates, the slow, heavy, and poorly defended Roman grain ships were the perfect target. They were the lumbering, helpless whales of the ancient sea, and the pirates were the killer sharks. A pirate fleet could easily run down a merchantman. Its crew would be overwhelmed, its sailors either killed or more likely captured and sold into the booming slave markets of the East. The cargo of grain, a commodity of immense value in a hungry world, would then be seized. The pirates could either sell this stolen grain on the black market or, even more damagingly, simply destroy it. This was not just a commercial risk for the merchants, it was a strategic threat to the Roman state. Every ship captured by pirates meant less food for the city, higher prices for the grain that did get through, and a greater risk of the bread riots that Roman politicians so deeply feared. The merchant fleets would have traveled in convoys for protection, and some may have even hired their own armed guards. But against the organized, large-scale threat of the great pirate fleets, this was often a futile defense. The Roman Republic, for much of its history, had neglected its navy, seeing itself as a land power. This policy had effectively ceded control of the sea, the very highway of its most vital economy, to these non-state actors. The failure of the state to provide security for its own lifeline was a catastrophic abdication of responsibility, a weakness that would be ruthlessly exploited, and one that would eventually force the Republic into a new, more aggressive, and ultimately more imperial posture. The Pontic Pipeline was an artery of immense value, and any artery so rich is bound to attract predators. In the final, chaotic centuries of the Roman Republic, the greatest of these predators was a powerful and highly organized naval force that operated with impunity across the entire eastern Mediterranean. To the Romans, they were a plague, a lawless scourge that threatened the very foundations of their food security and economic stability. But this was a profound underestimation of their nature. The pirates of Cilicia were not just a scattered collection of bandits. They were a sophisticated, multinational enterprise, a quasi-state with its own bases, its own command structure, and its own brutal but highly effective economy. They were the masters of a shadow empire, and their primary business was the systematic strangulation of Rome's most vulnerable lifeline. Their name came from their primary base of operations, the rugged, mountainous, and deeply indented coastline of rough Cilicia in modern-day southern Turkey. This was a pirate's paradise, a natural fortress of hidden coves, secret anchorages, and easily defensible hilltop forts. From this secure haven, their influence spread. At their peak, they controlled a network of harbors and strongholds across the eastern Mediterranean, from Crete to the islands of the Aegean. This was not a loose confederation, it was a powerful and organized thalassocracy, a sea-based power that directly challenged Rome's claim to rule the waves. The historian Plutarch claimed they commanded over 1,000 ships and had captured 400 cities, a clear, if likely exaggerated, sign of their immense power. Who were these pirates? They were a cosmopolitan mix of the dispossessed and the ambitious from across the ancient world. They were native Cilicians, disenfranchised Greeks, rebellious Anatolians, and runaway slaves, all drawn to the immense profits and the strange, brutal freedom of the pirate life. They were organized into fleets, each with its own admiral, and they operated with a level of military discipline that could rival a state navy. Their ships of choice were light, fast, and highly maneuverable galleys, like the Lembas or the Myoparo, vessels designed for speed and surprise, perfect for running down the slow, clumsy Roman merchant ships. The pirates' business model was a diversified and highly profitable one. Their most famous activity was the slave trade. They would raid coastal towns and villages, carrying off entire populations to be sold in the great slave markets of the East, like the one on the island of Delos. But their most strategic and damaging enterprise was the systematic interdiction of the grain trade. The Pontic Pipeline, with its constant, predictable stream of heavy, slow-moving, and immensely valuable grain ships, was their primary target. For the pirates, a captured grain ship was a jackpot. The crew could be sold as slaves, the ship itself could be repurposed for their own fleet, and the cargo of grain was a commodity of immense value, a liquid asset that could be easily sold on the black market to cities and states that were also suffering from shortages. But their strategy was often more insidious than simple plunder. They engaged in what we would today call economic warfare. By disrupting the grain supply, they could manipulate the market. A successful series of raids could create an artificial scarcity in the great consumer cities, causing the price of grain to skyrocket. The pirates, who now controlled the stolen supply, could then sell their captured wheat at this inflated price, a masterpiece of market manipulation. They understood the economy of scarcity. They were not just parasites on the Roman economy, they were active, and often brilliant, economic terrorists. The effect on Rome was catastrophic. In the early 1st century BC, the Cilician Pirates had grown so powerful that they had created a near-total blockade of the sea lanes. The historian Appian describes the situation in grim detail. They not only attacked ships, but ravaged islands and maritime towns. He continues, the seas were unsafe, all commerce was cut off, and the city of Rome was threatened with a grievous famine. The price of grain in the capital soared to unsustainable levels. The flow of wheat from the Pontic Pipeline and from Rome's other suppliers in Sicily and Sardinia had been reduced to a mere trickle. The city was starving, the urban mob, the great volatile underclass, was on the verge of open revolt. This was a national security crisis of the highest order. The pirates had exposed the fatal weakness at the heart of the Roman Republic, its utter dependency on a maritime supply chain that it did not control. The Roman elite, who had for so long neglected their navy, were now paying the price. The pirates, once dismissed as a minor nuisance, had brought the world's greatest superpower to its knees. They had proven that the true power in the Mediterranean did not belong to the state that commanded the most legions, but to the one that commanded the sea. This humiliating and terrifying crisis would finally force the Roman Senate to act, to abandon its old, ad hoc policies, and to take on the pirates in a new, more total, and more revolutionary kind of war. By the year 67 BC, the Roman Republic was in a state of crisis. The Cilician Pirates had achieved a near-total stranglehold on the Mediterranean, and their primary target, the Pontic grain pipeline, was severed. The city of Rome was starving, its streets on the verge of erupting into open revolt. The Senate, which had dithered and failed to address the problem for decades, was finally forced into a corner. Their response was an act of almost desperate improvisation, a legal and military gamble of unprecedented scale. They passed a law, the Lex Gabinia, which granted a single man, the brilliant and ambitious general Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, or Pompey the Great, an extraordinary and almost dictatorial level of power to deal with the pirate menace once and for all. The war that followed was not just a police action, it was the moment the Roman Republic finally and irrevocably accepted that its economic lifelines had to be secured by the full, overwhelming force of its military might. The powers granted to Pompey were breathtaking, a clear sign of the Senate's desperation. The Lex Gabinia gave him supreme command, imperium infinitum, over the entire Mediterranean Sea and all of its coastlines for a distance of 50 miles inland. This effectively gave him authority that superseded that of every other provincial governor in almost half the empire. He was given a massive fleet of 500 ships, an army of 120,000 infantry and 500 cavalry, and a nearly unlimited budget from the state treasury. It was the single largest and most powerful military command ever granted to one man in the history of the Republic. It was a terrifying concentration of power, a move that many conservative senators feared was a greater threat to the Republic than the pirates themselves. But the hunger of the mob was a more immediate threat. Pompey's strategic genius was not in fighting a single, decisive battle, but in understanding that he was fighting a systemic, economic war. The pirates were not a single army, they were a vast, decentralized network. To defeat them, he had to wage a war of logistics, of intelligence, and of overwhelming, simultaneous pressure. He did not simply gather his fleet and sail for Cilicia. Instead, he divided the entire Mediterranean into 13 separate districts, each with its own fleet and its own commander. His plan was a masterpiece of coordinated, network-centric warfare. The campaign was launched with stunning speed and efficiency. On his command, all 13 of his fleets began their operations at once. In the western Mediterranean, his forces swept eastwards from the Pillars of Hercules, driving the pirates before them, clearing the seas around Spain, Sardinia, and Sicily. This immediately secured the other grain routes and relieved the immediate pressure on the city of Rome. At the same time, his other fleets were systematically securing the key islands, the coast of Italy, and the shores of Greece. This was not a hunt, it was a dragnet. The pirates, accustomed to being able to flee from one part of the sea to another, suddenly found themselves with nowhere to run. They were being systematically corralled, driven from all directions into their home territory, the pirate heartland of rough Cilicia. The entire first phase of the war, the complete clearing of the western Mediterranean and the securing of the vital trade routes, was completed in a mere 40 days. It was a logistical and military achievement of almost unbelievable speed, a testament to Pompey's brilliant organization. The effect on the Roman economy was instantaneous. As soon as the sea lanes were secure, the price of grain in Rome plummeted back to normal levels. The threat of famine was over. Pompey was hailed as a savior. He had, in just over a month, solved the crisis that had plagued the Republic for a generation. Now, he moved in for the kill. He concentrated his massive fleet and his army on the Cilician coast itself. But here, his strategy shifted from pure military force to a shrewd and pragmatic political and economic solution. Any pirate who surrendered voluntarily would be granted a pardon. There would be no crucifixions, no mass executions. Instead, he offered them a new life. He used the state's resources to resettle the surrendered pirates, not on the coast where they could return to their old ways, but in depopulated, inland agricultural towns where they were given land and a chance to become productive farmers. He was not just destroying the pirate network, he was reintegrating its members into the Roman economy. For the hardcore pirate chiefs who refused to surrender, there was no mercy. Pompey's legions stormed their hilltop fortresses, and his fleet blockaded their secret harbors. The final pirate strongholds were destroyed, their treasures were confiscated for the Roman treasury, and their leaders were executed. In a total of just 3 months, the entire war was over. A threat that had brought Rome to its knees had been completely and utterly eradicated. Pompey's war against the pirates was a pivotal moment in Roman history. It was a stunning demonstration of the state's military and logistical power when properly organized and funded. But more importantly, it was a profound strategic lesson. It was the moment the Roman state finally took direct, overwhelming responsibility for the security of its globalized economy. The old republican model of a reactive, hands-off approach to commerce was dead. The new model, the model that would define the coming empire, was one of aggressive military intervention to secure the arteries of trade. The Pontic Pipeline was safe, for now, But the very act of saving it had created a new and more dangerous precedent: the rise of the military strongman, the savior who could command the absolute loyalty of a massive army and the adoration of the common people. By the year 67 BC, the Roman Republic was in a state of crisis. The Cilician Pirates had achieved a near-total stranglehold on the Mediterranean, and their primary target, the Pontic grain pipeline, was severed. The city of Rome was starving, its streets on the verge of erupting into open revolt. The Senate, which had dithered and failed to address the problem for decades, was finally forced into a corner. Their response was an act of almost desperate improvisation, a legal and military gamble of unprecedented scale. They passed a law, the Lex Gabinia, which granted a single man, the brilliant and ambitious general Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, or Pompey the Great, an extraordinary and almost dictatorial level of power to deal with the pirate menace once and for all. The war that followed was not just a police action, it was the moment the Roman Republic finally and irrevocably accepted that its economic lifelines had to be secured by the full, overwhelming force of its military might. The powers granted to Pompey were breathtaking, a clear sign of the Senate's desperation. The Lex Gabinia gave him supreme command, imperium infinitum, over the entire Mediterranean Sea and all of its coastlines for a distance of 50 miles inland. This effectively gave him authority that superseded that of every other provincial governor in almost half the empire. He was given a massive fleet of 500 ships, an army of 20,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry, and a nearly unlimited budget from the state treasury. It was the single largest and most powerful military command ever granted to one man in the history of the Republic. It was a terrifying concentration of power, a move that many conservative senators feared was a greater threat to the Republic than the pirates themselves. But the hunger of the mob was a more immediate threat. Pompey's strategic genius was not in fighting a single, decisive battle, but in understanding that he was fighting a systemic economic war. The pirates were not a single army, they were a vast, decentralized network. To defeat them, he had to wage a war of logistics, of intelligence, and of overwhelming simultaneous pressure. He did not simply gather his fleet and sail for Cilicia. Instead, he divided the entire Mediterranean into 13 separate districts, each with its own fleet and its own commander. His plan was a masterpiece of coordinated, network-centric warfare. The campaign was launched with stunning speed and efficiency. On his command, all 13 of his fleets began their operations at once. In the western Mediterranean, his forces swept eastwards from the Pillars of Hercules, driving the pirates before them, clearing the seas around Spain, Sardinia, and Sicily. This immediately secured the other grain routes and relieved the immediate pressure on the city of Rome. At the same time, his other fleets were systematically securing the key islands, the coast of Italy, and the shores of Greece. This was not a hunt, it was a dragnet. The pirates, accustomed to being able to flee from one part of the sea to another, suddenly found themselves with nowhere to run. They were being systematically corralled, driven from all directions into their home territory, the pirate heartland of rough Cilicia. It was a logistical and military achievement of almost unbelievable speed, a testament to Pompey's brilliant organization. The effect on the Roman economy was instantaneous. As soon as the sea lanes were secure, the price of grain in Rome plummeted back to normal levels. The threat of famine was over. Pompey was hailed as a savior. He had, in just over a month, solved the crisis that had plagued the Republic for a generation. Now, he moved in for the kill. He concentrated his massive fleet and his army on the Cilician coast itself. But here, his strategy shifted from pure military force to a shrewd and pragmatic political and economic solution. He knew that the pirates were not monsters, but were, for the most part, desperate men who had been driven to piracy by poverty and a lack of opportunity. He offered them a choice. Any pirate who surrendered voluntarily would be granted a pardon. There would be no crucifixions, no mass executions. Instead, he offered them a new life. He used the state's resources to resettle the surrendered pirates, not on the coast where they could return to their old ways, but in depopulated, inland agricultural towns where they were given land and a chance to become productive farmers. He was not just destroying the pirate network, he was reintegrating its members into the Roman economy. For the hardcore pirate chiefs who refused to surrender, there was no mercy. Pompey's legions stormed their hilltop fortresses, and his fleet blockaded their secret harbors. The final pirate strongholds were destroyed, their treasures were confiscated for the Roman treasury, and their leaders were executed. In a total of just 3 months, the entire war was over. A threat that had brought Rome to its knees had been completely and utterly eradicated. Pompey's war against the pirates was a pivotal moment in Roman history. It was a stunning demonstration of the state's military and logistical power when properly organized and funded. But more importantly, it was a profound strategic lesson. It was the moment the Roman state finally took direct, overwhelming responsibility for the security of its globalized economy. The old Republican model of a reactive, hands-off approach to commerce was dead. The new model, the model that would define the coming empire, was one of aggressive military intervention to secure the arteries of trade. The Pontic Pipeline was safe, for now, but the very act of saving it had created a new and more dangerous precedent: the rise of the military strongman, the savior who could command the absolute loyalty of a massive army and the adoration of the common people. Pompey's war had eliminated the non-state actors, the pirates who had preyed upon the Pontic Pipeline, but the Republic would soon face a far greater, more intelligent, and more dangerous threat. This was not a chaotic network of raiders, but a rival king with a grand imperial vision of his own. He was Mithridates vi Eupator, the king of Pontus, and he was one of the most formidable and relentless enemies Rome would ever face. Mithridates was a man who understood the language of power, of poison, and, above all, of geopolitics. He recognized the Pontic grain trade for what it was, the strategic center of gravity for the entire region, and the Achilles heel of the Roman Republic. His decades-long struggle with Rome was not just a war of conquest, it was the world's first pipeline war, a grand strategic conflict for the absolute control of the economy of the Black Sea. The kingdom of Pontus was, like Lydia before it, a kingdom at a crossroads. Located on the southern coast of the Black Sea in modern-day northern Turkey, it was a hybrid kingdom, a fusion of ancient Persian aristocracy and vibrant Greek coastal culture. And it sat in a position of immense strategic importance. It was a major producer of timber, iron, and other resources in its own right, but its greatest asset was its location. It was the southern anchor of the Black Sea world, a powerful state that could exert immense influence on the flow of trade that passed by its shores, and, most importantly, on the Bosporan kingdom in the Crimea, the great export hub of the entire grain pipeline. Mithridates himself was a figure of almost mythical proportions. He was a man of incredible physical strength, a master of poisons who supposedly immunized himself by taking a daily cocktail of toxins, and a brilliant linguist who could reportedly speak over 20 languages, allowing him to deal directly with the many barbarian tribes he sought to bring into his coalition. But above all, he was a man with a singular burning ambition to drive the Romans out of Asia and to forge a great, new Hellenistic Persian empire of his own. And he knew that the key to defeating Rome was to strike at its greatest vulnerability, its food supply. His grand strategy was a masterpiece of economic warfare, implemented over decades. First, he used his armies and his diplomatic skill to consolidate his power around the entire Black Sea basin. He brought the Scythian tribes of the northern plains into his sphere of influence. He intervened in the politics of the Bosporan kingdom, eventually installing his own son as its king, and he used his powerful navy to establish complete dominance over the waters of the Black Sea. By the beginning of the 1st century BC, he had achieved the first stage of his plan. The entire Pontic Pipeline, from the grain fields of the north to the export ports in the Crimea, was now firmly under his control. He was the master of the breadbasket. Next, he expanded his power southwards into Roman-controlled Asia Minor, presenting himself as a liberator to the Greek cities that chafed under the notoriously corrupt and oppressive rule of the Roman tax collectors. In a brutal and shocking act of coordinated violence in 88 BC, known as the Asiatic Vespers, he orchestrated the massacre of an estimated 80,000 Roman and Italian citizens living in Anatolia, a declaration of total war against the Republic. With Asia Minor and the Black Sea now under his control, he held all the cards. He had seized the pipeline at its source. He could, at will, turn off the tap. The flow of grain to Rome, which was already being hampered by the pirates, whom Mithridates often secretly aided and abetted, was now subject to the whims of its greatest enemy. The economic consequences for Rome were dire. leading to the very food shortages and political instability that would necessitate Pompey's extraordinary command. The Great Mithridatic Wars, which would rage for over 25 years, were, at their heart, a struggle for the control of this vital artery of ancient trade. The Romans, recognizing the existential threat, threw their best generals at him, one after another. Sulla, Lucullus, and finally, Pompey the Great. The wars were vast, complex, and incredibly bloody, fought across a dozen different fronts, from the mountains of Armenia to the plains of Greece, but the strategic center of gravity always remained the same. Roman strategy was always aimed at breaking Mithridates' grip on the sources of his wealth and power, the grain trade of the Black Sea and the rich resources of Anatolia. When the Roman general Lucullus finally managed to break through and defeat Mithridates' field armies, his next move was telling. He marched on the Bosporan kingdom, the economic engine room of the Pontic Empire, to cut off his enemies' supplies at their source. Ultimately, Mithridates was defeated by the overwhelming military and financial resources of the Roman state, a war of attrition that he could not win. He was cornered in his last stronghold in the Crimea and, according to legend, took his own life, his body so inured to poison that he had to ask his bodyguard to kill him with a sword. His grand ambition of a new Eastern Empire was in ruins. He had correctly identified the Pontic Pipeline as the great strategic prize of the age. His long and bloody struggle was the ultimate proof of the pipeline's importance and the immense continent-spanning war that was fought to control. It was a powerful and prophetic lesson for the Romans. It was a lesson they would never forget, that to be a true superpower, you must never, ever allow your most vital supply chain to fall into the hands of a rival. The struggle for the Pontic Pipeline was a grand geopolitical drama, a story of pirates, generals, and kings. But beneath this layer of high politics and military strategy, the pipeline was, at its heart, a business. Unlike the later, state-run owner of the Roman Empire, which was a massive public utility, the Republican grain trade from the Black Sea was a chaotic, speculative, and overwhelmingly private sector affair. It was a world of risk-taking entrepreneurs, of complex financial instruments, and of the constant, dynamic tension between the pursuit of private profit and the desperate public need of the Roman state. The story of this economy is a fascinating glimpse into the raw, often brutal capitalism of the Roman Republic. The key players in this enterprise were the Roman negotiators, a class of businessmen, traders, and financiers, often from the equestrian order. These were not gentlemen farmers or aristocrats. They were the capitalists of their day. They were the ones who had the capital, the ships, and the network of contacts to engage in this high-risk, high-reward international trade. A wealthy negotiator or a consortium of them would fund a voyage. They would charter the ships, hire the crews, and send their agents to the great grain markets of the Bosporan kingdom. There, these agents would use Roman silver to buy up the grain surplus from the Pontic Greek merchants who had themselves acquired it from the Scythian farmers. This was a purely speculative enterprise. The price of grain in the Black Sea could fluctuate wildly, based on the success of the local harvest. The risks of the journey were immense, as we have seen. A ship could be lost to a storm, captured by pirates, or have its cargo spoil in the hold, but the potential profits were colossal. If a merchant could successfully land a cargo of grain in a Roman port like Puteoli, especially during a time of shortage, he could sell it for many times its original purchase price. The grain trade was one of the great engines of private wealth creation in the late Republic, and it created a powerful and influential class of commercial interests. This private, profit-driven system, however, was on a collision course with the needs of the state. The Roman state had one overriding concern: keeping the price of grain in the city of Rome low and stable. A sudden spike in the price of bread was the single most common cause of riots and political instability. This created a fundamental tension. The private merchants naturally wanted to sell their grain for the highest possible price, while the state wanted them to sell it for the lowest possible price. For much of the Republic, the government's approach was one of ad hoc, reactive intervention. In times of crisis, the Senate would appoint a magistrate and give him a special budget to buy up grain on the international market and bring it to Rome to be sold at a subsidized price or, in emergencies, distributed for free. This created a chaotic and unpredictable market. A private merchant might be sailing his precious cargo to Rome, expecting to make a fortune, only to find that a state-funded grain shipment had arrived just before him, causing the market price to collapse. The state was, in effect, the market's biggest and most unpredictable competitor. This constant tension made the economy of the grain trade even more speculative and dangerous. It also opened the door to immense corruption and political manipulation. The great public contracts for supplying grain were some of the most lucrative in the Roman world, and they were often awarded to the political allies of the powerful. A wealthy senator, while legally barred from direct trade, could secretly finance a merchant's voyage, use his political influence to help his partner secure a state contract, and then take a massive share of the profits. The grain trade became deeply intertwined with the vicious, factional politics of the late Republic. Furthermore, the state's reliance on these private traders for its very survival was a source of immense strategic weakness. The negotiators were businessmen, not patriots. Their primary loyalty was to their bottom line. During the wars with Mithridates, for example, many Roman traders, seeing a chance for greater profits, were perfectly willing to trade with the enemy, supplying him with the goods and the capital he needed to continue his war against Rome. The state had outsourced its most critical supply chain to a class of people whose interests were not always aligned with its own. This entire, messy and inefficient system, a chaotic mix of private enterprise, state intervention, political corruption, and strategic vulnerability, is what ultimately led to its own demise. The century of chaos had proven that the free market on its own could not be relied upon to guarantee the food security of a superpower. When Augustus finally came to power and established the empire, one of his first and most important reforms was to solve this problem permanently. He took the lessons learned from the Pontic Pipeline and created the imperial annona. The grain supply was now too important to be left to the private sector. It became a state-run, military-grade logistical operation. Its primary pipeline shifted to the safer and more easily controlled provinces of Egypt and North Africa. The age of the private grain speculator was over. The age of the state-run command economy had begun, a direct and lasting consequence of the turbulent and chaotic history of the Pontic Pipeline. The Pontic Pipeline was more than just a trade route, it was the crucible in which the Roman Empire was forged. The century-long struggle to control this vital economic artery did more than just fill the bellies of the Roman mob and the coffers of its merchants. It fundamentally and irrevocably broke the political structure of the Roman Republic. The old, creaking city-state institutions, designed for a world of small-scale, seasonal warfare, proved completely inadequate for the immense geopolitical and military challenges of managing a global supply chain. The desperate need to secure the pipeline forced the Senate to create a series of extraordinary, supra-constitutional military commands, concentrating unprecedented power in the hands of a few ambitious individuals. These were the great warlords of the late Republic, the men who would, in the name of saving the state, ultimately dismantle it. The Republic's traditional model of power was deliberately diffused. Its highest office, the consulship, was shared between two men, and their term lasted for only a single year. A general's command was tied to a specific province and a specific, limited objective. This system was designed, above all, to prevent any one man from accumulating enough power to become a king. But this system was completely ill-suited to the new challenges of the 1st century BC. The threat posed by the Cilician Pirates was not a provincial problem, it was a pan-Mediterranean crisis. The war against Mithridates was not a single, short campaign, it was a multi-front, decade-long struggle. These were problems that required a new kind of solution, a unified, long-term, and overwhelmingly powerful military command. The Lex Gabinia of 67 BC, which gave Pompey the Great his extraordinary command to fight the pirates, was the moment the old system shattered. By granting one man supreme authority over the entire sea and its coastlines, the Senate was admitting that its traditional, committee-based form of governance was no longer capable of protecting the state's most vital interests. Pompey's stunning, 3-month success was a spectacular vindication of this new model, but it was also a terrifying precedent. It proved that a single, powerful individual, given the right resources, could solve problems that the Senate had been unable to handle for decades. The Roman people, who had suffered under the high grain prices, saw him not as a threat to the constitution, but as a savior. The very next year, this precedent was taken a step further. The war against Mithridates was still raging, and the general in charge, Lucullus, was making slow progress. A new law, the Lex Manilia, was passed, which transferred the command of this war, the largest and most important of the era, to Pompey, on top of the immense powers he already held. He was now, in effect, the supreme military commander of the entire Roman East, a proconsul with an authority that rivaled that of Alexander the Great. His success was, once again, total. He decisively defeated Mithridates, redrew the entire map of the East, and brought vast new territories and immense new wealth under Roman control. When he returned to Rome, he was the most powerful, the most popular, and the most celebrated man in the world. The old republican balance of power was broken. This was the new template for power in Rome, a template forged in the crucible of the wars for the Pontic Pipeline. The state's survival and prosperity now seemed to depend on the genius of these larger-than-life individuals. And the armies they commanded were no longer the old citizen levies, loyal to the Republic. They were professional, long-serving soldiers whose pay, whose retirement benefits, and whose very livelihoods depended on the personal success and political influence of their general. They were Pompey's men, and later they would be Caesar's men. Their loyalty was to their commander, not to the distant and dysfunctional Senate. The final act of this tragedy was set in motion by the very success of men like Pompey. Julius Caesar, seeing the path to power that Pompey had blazed, saw a great, long-term command of his own, the conquest of Gaul. Here, for a decade, he forged an army that was fanatically loyal to him personally. The immense wealth he plundered from Gaul gave him the financial resources to rival even Pompey. The final confrontation was inevitable. The civil war between Caesar and Pompey was a war between two of these great, pipeline-forged warlords, a clash of two private armies whose commanders had grown too powerful for the Republic to contain. When Caesar finally emerged as the sole victor, the Republic was a hollow shell. The man who now controlled Rome was a man whose power rested not on election or consensus, but on the unshakable loyalty of his legions. His adopted son, Augustus, would learn the lessons of this century of chaos perfectly. He would keep the outward forms of the Republic, but he would concentrate all the key military and political powers, the powers that had been created out of necessity to solve the crisis of the grain trade, in his own hands. And one of the first things he did was to take personal, absolute, and permanent control over the grain supply itself, first from the Black Sea and then from his new private domain of Egypt. The chaotic, privatized, and vulnerable Pontic Pipeline, which had inadvertently created the warlords who destroyed the Republic, was replaced by the stable, state-run, and imperial Annona. The price of securing the food supply, in the end, was the Republic itself. Our investigation began with a single, humble grain ship, a symbol of the forgotten lifeline that sustained the Roman Republic. We sought to understand the vast commercial and political system that this ship represented. Having traced the Pontic Pipeline from the fertile barbarian fields of the Black Sea, through the perilous straits and pirate-infested waters of the Aegean, and into the heart of the roiling political world of Rome, the evidence is now clear. The verdict is that the Pontic Pipeline was the critical economic artery of the late Republic. It was a system that not only fed the city and its armies, but whose inherent vulnerabilities and the immense struggle to control it became a primary engine of the Republic's own transformation and its ultimate destruction. We have established that a profound agricultural crisis in Italy, driven by war and the rise of the latifundia, created a structural grain deficit. This made the Republic dangerously dependent on foreign imports for its very survival. The Pontic Pipeline, a vast, privately run maritime trade network connecting Rome to the breadbasket of the Black Sea, was the chaotic but essential solution to this crisis. Our investigation has demonstrated that this pipeline was a fragile and high-risk enterprise. We have charted its perilous sea routes and identified the two great threats to its existence. The first was a non-state actor, the powerful, organized Cilician Pirates who waged a successful economic war that nearly starved Rome. The second was a state actor, the ambitious King Mithridates of Pontus, who brilliantly attempted to seize control of the entire pipeline from its source. These threats proved that the Republic's hands-off, privatized approach to its most vital supply chain was a catastrophic failure. Crucially, we have shown that the Republic's response to these threats was the catalyst for its own undoing. The desperate need to secure the pipeline led to the creation of unprecedented, extra-constitutional military commands for individuals like Pompey the Great. These saviors, empowered to solve the economic crisis, became military warlords with private armies, loyal to them personally rather than to the state. Therefore, the final conclusion of our investigation is this: the Pontic Pipeline was both the lifeline and the noose of the Roman Republic. The struggle to control it forced Rome to develop a new, more aggressive, and more imperial posture towards the management of its global economy. But the very tools it created to do so, the great, powerful, and independent military commands, were the very instruments that ambitious men would use to dismantle the Republic's ancient institutions. The wars fought to save the Republic's economy were the very wars that destroyed its political soul. The Pontic Pipeline was, in the end, the training ground for the Roman Empire. The great grain fleets of the Pontic Pipeline have long since sailed into history. The names of the private negotiators are forgotten, and the specific crises they faced have been superseded by the grand imperial stability of the Annona that followed. But the story of this chaotic Republican-era supply chain is far more than a simple prelude to the story of empire. It is a raw and powerful case study in one of the most enduring and fundamental truths of history, that the control of food is the control of power. The century-long struggle for the Black Sea grain is the ultimate proof that no great power can afford to be indifferent to its most critical supply chains. The Roman Republic's initial, hands-off approach, relying on the invisible hand of private merchants to provide its most essential commodity, was a catastrophic failure. It created a system of immense vulnerability that was ruthlessly exploited by pirates, by rival kings, and by corrupt politicians. The lesson that Rome was forced to learn, at the cost of immense blood and treasure, is a lesson that every superpower in history has had to learn in its turn. A state that does not control its own lifeline is not a sovereign state. The journey from the private enterprise of the Pontic Pipeline to the state-run militarization of the imperial Annona is a perfect model for the evolution of a superpower's thinking about its own strategic security. This story also provides a powerful and eternal blueprint for how nations behave when their vital interests are threatened. Faced with a systemic threat to its economy, the Roman Republic abandoned its own long-held traditions and laws, concentrating immense power in the hands of saviors like Pompey. This is a pattern that has repeated itself throughout history. In times of profound crisis, societies are often willing to sacrifice their political freedoms in exchange for economic stability and security. The story of the Pontic Pipeline is a sobering reminder that the very institutions of a state can be bent and ultimately broken by the desperate need to secure the resources that sustain it. Finally, the story of this forgotten lifeline reminds us that behind the grand narratives of politics and war, there are the fundamental, logistical realities of human existence. The rise of the great warlords, the fall of the Republic, the birth of the Roman Empire, all of these monumental events were inextricably linked to the simple, humble, and relentless need to get a shipload of wheat from a port in the Crimea to a bakery in Rome. The Pontic Pipeline is a testament to the fact that history is often shaped not just by the grand ambitions of great men, but by the quiet, powerful, and unforgiving logic of the supply chain. The echoes of this ancient artery of trade can be seen today in every geopolitical struggle over oil pipelines, shipping lanes, and the global flow of essential goods. The Roman Republic was simply the first to learn, on a global scale, the hard and bloody lesson that the line that feeds you is also the rope that can hang you.